There are ways of inhabiting urban space that create profound isolation despite constant physical proximity to thousands of other people, where daily life involves navigating crowded streets and shared elevators and open-plan offices without developing substantive connections to any of the individuals encountered in those spaces, where the combination of professional focus and social exhaustion and the anonymity that large cities provide creates patterns of existence that are functionally solitary even though they occur within densely populated environments. Julian Moretti had been living such an existence for approximately 7 years, since relocating to the unnamed metropolis, coastal city of roughly 4 million residents, major hub for architecture and design industries, at age 28 to accept position at prestigious architecture firm that specialized in commercial and institutional buildings, since establishing routines and habits that maximized his professional productivity while minimizing the emotional demands of maintaining active social life, since gradually allowing most friendships from his previous life to fade through benign neglect rather than through any deliberate choice to isolate himself. He was now 35 years old, occupied position as senior architect at the firm where he'd started 7 years earlier, had accumulated portfolio of completed projects that demonstrated genuine talent and that had earned respect from colleagues and recognition within the regional architecture community. Lived alone in one-bedroom apartment in older residential building approximately 20 minutes by subway from his office, maintained lifestyle that was comfortable but not particularly remarkable or memorable, that consisted primarily of work and solitary leisure activities and minimal social engagement beyond professional obligations. The apartment was on the 9th floor of 12-story building constructed in the 1960s, featured the kind of basic efficient layout characteristic of that era's mid-market urban housing, narrow entry corridor opening into combined living and dining area maybe 250 square feet, small galley kitchen sufficient for basic meal preparation but not for any serious cooking, bedroom barely large enough to accommodate queen bed and modest dresser, bathroom with standard fixtures that functioned adequately, if without any notable character or quality. Julian had lived in this apartment for approximately 5 years, had furnished it with minimal but functional pieces purchased primarily from IKEA and from online retailers, had decorated it barely at all beyond hanging few prints on walls and placing some books on shelves, had made no effort to personalize the space in ways that would have expressed individual taste or created particular atmosphere. The apartment served its purpose as place to sleep and to spend limited non-working hours, but it didn't feel like home exactly, felt more like temporary accommodation that he'd somehow been occupying for half a decade without ever fully settling in or committing to making it truly his own. His daily routine was consistent and structured, had been refined over years to maximize efficiency and to minimize decision-making fatigue. Wake at 6:30 a.m. to alarm on phone, spend approximately 10 minutes lying in bed gradually transitioning to wakefulness while scrolling through news headlines and email to check whether any urgent matters required immediate attention. Rise at 6:40 a.m., proceed to bathroom for morning hygiene routine, shower, shaving, teeth brushing, the various grooming activities that maintain professional appearance appropriate to his role at the firm. Return to bedroom to dress in clothing selected the previous evening to eliminate morning decision-making, typically some variation of dark pants and collared shirt and sweater or blazer depending on whether he had client meetings scheduled. Breakfast was minimal, coffee prepared in French press, perhaps some toast or yogurt if he felt hungry enough to bother eating, consumed while standing at kitchen counter or while sitting at small dining table reviewing work materials or continuing to scroll through phone. Departure for work occurred around 7:35 a.m., timing calculated to arrive at subway station just before train he preferred to take would arrive, minimizing waiting time on platform while still ensuring he'd board train with space to sit rather than having to stand for the 20-minute ride to the station near his office. The commute was typically spent reading, either professional journals related to architecture and design or occasionally fiction, though lately he'd found concentration difficult and had often spent the ride just staring out window watching the city pass without really processing what he was seeing. Arrival at office around 8:15 a.m., earlier than most colleagues who tended to arrive closer to 9 a.m., allowing him approximately 45 minutes of relatively quiet time to organize his day before the office became busy with meetings and collaborative work sessions and the various interruptions that characterized normal workday. Work consumed most of his waking hours, not just the standard 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. office time but also frequent evening hours spent at his home computer working on designs or preparing presentations or responding to client communications. Julian was genuinely engaged with his architectural work, found it intellectually satisfying in ways that justified the time investment, took pride in the buildings and spaces he designed and in the positive feedback he received from clients and from colleagues who recognized his talent. But the work also served function of filling time that might otherwise have been devoted to social activities or personal relationships that he found exhausting or anxiety-inducing, provided legitimate excuse for declining invitations and for avoiding commitments that would have required emotional energy he didn't feel he possessed. His social life beyond work was minimal and mostly consisted of professional networking events that he attended out of career obligation rather than genuine interest. Occasional dinners with the 2 or 3 colleagues he considered something approaching friends, though the relationships remained fairly superficial, very rare visits from his sister who lived several hours away and who would occasionally come to the city for weekends and would stay with Julian and would express concern about how isolated his life seemed. His sister's concerns were well-intentioned but felt intrusive. She'd suggest he should date or join social groups or pursue hobbies that would connect him with other people, would frame his solitary lifestyle as problem requiring solution rather than as legitimate choice about how to allocate his limited social energy. Julian didn't particularly experience his solitary existence as lonely or problematic most of the time. Found it comfortable and manageable, appreciated the autonomy and the lack of social obligations, valued the ability to structure his time according to his own preferences without needing to coordinate with others or to meet their expectations. But there were moments, usually late evening or early morning, in the transitional periods between sleep and waking or between work focus and home relaxation, when he'd feel something like loneliness or disconnection, would become aware that he was conducting his entire life without any particularly intimate relationships or meaningful connections beyond his professional work, would question whether this was actually how he wanted to live or whether he was just defaulting into isolation because it required less effort than actively building and maintaining relationships. These moments of questioning were uncomfortable and were typically pushed aside through return to work focus or through distraction with reading or television or internet browsing. But they accumulated over time, created low-level background awareness that something might be missing or unsustainable about how he was living, that the efficient solitary routine he'd constructed might be serving him well professionally while leaving some essential human needs unmet. The morning when Julian first spoke to his reflection, Thursday, November 3rd, unremarkable autumn day with overcast skies and temperatures in the low 50s, began like any other morning with the 6:30 a.m. alarm and the gradual waking process and the eventual movement to the bathroom for morning hygiene routine. But something was different in ways Julian couldn't quite identify at first, some quality of mood or consciousness that felt slightly off from his normal morning state, that created sense of heightened awareness or vulnerability that made his internal experience feel more present and immediate than it typically did during the automatic execution of his morning routine. He was standing at the bathroom sink brushing his teeth, looking at his face in the mirror without particularly seeing it in the way that one looks without really observing during routine activities that don't require conscious attention, when suddenly his reflection seemed to come into focus in ways that made him actually see what he was looking at, the 35-year-old man with dark hair beginning to show gray at temples, with lines forming around eyes from years of concentrating on detailed architectural drawings, with expression that was neutral to the point of being blank, that communicated nothing about internal experience or emotional state. And without consciously deciding to do so, Julian heard himself whisper, "Why do you keep avoiding that call?" His voice was quiet enough that it would barely have been audible outside the bathroom, was spoken to the reflection as if the reflection were separate person rather than just image of himself, carried tone of genuine inquiry rather than rhetorical musing. The question referred to phone call he'd been meaning to make to his sister, who'd left 2 voicemails over the past week asking him to call her back to discuss something she wanted to talk about, probably nothing urgent or problematic, just her wanting to check in and maintain connection as she periodically did. But Julian had been putting off returning the call because he found phone conversations with his sister emotionally draining in ways that made him want to delay them indefinitely even though he knew intellectually that he should maintain better contact. The act of asking this question aloud to his reflection created strange sensation, was simultaneously absurd and somehow meaningful, felt like he'd violated some implicit rule about what constituted normal behavior while also feeling like he'd stumbled onto something that might be valuable or revelatory. He stood there for a moment longer with toothbrush still in his mouth, looking at his reflection, waiting for something though he wasn't sure what, for the reflection to answer perhaps, which was obviously impossible and ridiculous, or for some internal clarity to emerge about why he'd asked the question and what response it deserved. No external answer came, but internal response emerged almost immediately. He was avoiding the call because talking to his sister required emotional presence and vulnerability that he found difficult, because she asked questions about his life that he didn't want to answer honestly because doing so would mean acknowledging dissatisfaction or loneliness that he preferred to keep suppressed, because the calls reminded him that he was living in ways that didn't align with who he'd once imagined he would become, and that recognition was painful enough that avoidance felt like reasonable strategy. The internal response was more honest than Julian typically allowed himself to be about his motivations and feelings, was accessing level of self-awareness that he usually kept carefully contained because accessing it created discomfort that disrupted his efficient functioning. But something about speaking the question aloud to his reflection had prompted that honest response in ways that just thinking the question silently wouldn't have achieved, had created slight distance between asking self and answering self that made honesty feel more possible. He finished brushing his teeth, rinsed his mouth, continued with the rest of his morning routine without dwelling further on what had just occurred. But throughout the day, during the subway commute and during the work hours at the office, he found his mind returning periodically to that moment of speaking to his reflection and to the honest internal response it had prompted, found himself wondering whether the experience had been random aberration or whether it represented something worth pursuing further. The next morning, Friday, November 4th, Julian deliberately recreated the experience, stood at the bathroom sink after showering and addressed his reflection with another question. You promised yourself you'd finish that presentation by today. Did you? The question referred to client presentation he'd been working on for the past week, that was due the following Monday, that he'd planned to complete by end of this week but that he'd been making slower progress on than intended because he'd been getting distracted and had been lacking the focus concentration the work required. The act of asking the question aloud was again strange, created self-consciousness about what he was doing and about whether this was normal behavior or whether it indicated something problematic about his mental state. But he pushed past the self-consciousness and waited for internal response to emerge. The response came, no, he hadn't finished the presentation, was probably going to end up working over the weekend to complete it, had been procrastinating because the presentation required making design recommendations that involved subjective judgments he wasn't confident about, and because delaying forced decision-making felt easier than committing to choices he wasn't certain were correct. The honest assessment was useful, created clarity about what he needed to do and about what psychological barriers were preventing him from doing it. Instead of just vaguely feeling behind on the presentation and anxious about the deadline, he now had explicit understanding of the specific problem, his uncertainty about the design recommendations, and could develop targeted strategy for addressing it rather than just continuing to procrastinate while feeling increasingly anxious. Over the following days and weeks, speaking to his reflection became regular part of Julian's morning routine, evolved from occasional occurrence into daily practice that he engaged in with increasing deliberateness and structure. Each morning after showering, he would stand at the sink and spend approximately 5 to 10 minutes addressing his reflection with various questions and observations and confessions, would allow whatever thoughts or concerns or judgments were present to be articulated aloud rather than remaining as unexamined internal experience. The content of these morning conversations varied based on what was occurring in his life and what psychological material was most present. Sometimes he'd ask practical questions about work tasks or decisions about how to spend his time. Sometimes he'd make confessions about mistakes or poor choices, acknowledging when he'd handled situation badly or had failed to follow through on commitment he'd made to himself. Sometimes he'd articulate ambitions or fears about his career or his personal life or his future. Sometimes he'd just narrate what he was feeling in the moment, tired, anxious, satisfied, frustrated, whatever emotional state was present. The reflection never responded vocally, obviously. Julian maintained enough grip on reality to know that mirrors don't talk back, that what he was doing was engaging in structured self-dialogue rather than having actual conversation with external entity. But the reflection did respond in sense that the act of speaking to it prompted internal responses, thoughts and feelings and insights that emerged in response to what he'd articulated aloud, that wouldn't have been accessed if he'd just thought about these topics silently without externalizing them through speech. The quality of these internal responses was different from his normal internal monologue. Typically his thoughts were somewhat chaotic and reactive, jumping between topics without much structure or depth, avoiding uncomfortable subjects through distraction or rationalization. But speaking to his reflection created container that encouraged more honest and sustained engagement with whatever topics he chose to address, created slight distance between speaking self and listening self that made it easier to acknowledge difficult truths without the immediate defensiveness that characterized his normal relationship to self-criticism. The reflection sometimes felt like supportive companion, like trusted friend who was witnessing his experience and offering quiet validation. But other times it felt more like demanding conscience, like stern observer who was holding him accountable for his choices and not accepting the comfortable rationalizations he typically offered for his avoidances and failures. The shifting quality seemed to depend partly on his mood and partly on what topics he was addressing, with supportive presence emerging around vulnerable admissions and demanding presence emerging around patterns of avoidance or self-deception that needed to be challenged. The internal changes that these morning conversations with his reflection were creating began to manifest in Julian's external life in ways that were subtle but noticeable to people who interacted with him regularly. His colleagues at the architecture firm noticed that he was speaking less in meetings and social interactions, was already fairly quiet person, but was becoming even more withdrawn from casual conversation and from the informal social exchanges that occurred around the office. Some interpreted this increased quietness as aloofness or disengagement, assumed Julian was becoming less interested in collaborative work or less invested in maintaining collegial relationships. But those who worked most closely with him on design projects noticed something else, that his architectural work was becoming bolder and more conceptually developed, was showing increased willingness to take creative risks and to propose unconventional solutions rather than defaulting to safe conventional approaches. His designs were becoming more human-scaled and thoughtful about how buildings would actually be experienced by people who occupied them rather than just being impressive formal exercises that looked good in renderings but didn't consider lived experience. His project manager noticed this shift during review of design proposal Julian had developed for mixed-use building that would combine residential units with ground-floor retail and community spaces. "This is different from your usual work," she commented, looking through the presentation materials. "More ambitious. More focused on how people will actually use these spaces rather than just on the building's formal qualities." What changed? Julian wasn't sure how to answer that question. How could he explain that the change was resulting from his morning conversations with his bathroom mirror, from the increased self-awareness and honesty that practice was cultivating, from the way that articulating his thoughts and concerns aloud was helping him identify and challenge the various fears and assumptions that had been constraining his creative work? The explanation would sound absurd, would make him seem mentally unstable or at least eccentric in ways that would be professionally damaging. So he offered vague response about having been thinking differently about architecture's social purposes, about wanting to design buildings that served human needs rather than just expressing aesthetic concepts. The response was true enough even if it didn't capture the actual mechanism through which that shift in thinking was occurring. The project manager accepted the explanation, seemed pleased that Julian was developing in this direction, suggested that the mixed-use building proposal demonstrated exactly the kind of innovative thinking the firm wanted to encourage. The changes weren't only professional. Julian also found himself making small modifications to his personal life and routines, changes that individually seemed minor but that collectively represented shift in how he was approaching his daily existence. He started calling his sister more regularly, would reach out every week or two rather than waiting for her to contact him and then avoiding her calls. The conversations were still somewhat difficult and emotionally demanding, but he found that addressing his avoidance directly during his morning reflection sessions made actually following through on calling her feel less daunting. He started occasionally accepting social invitations from colleagues rather than automatically declining, would join them for after-work drinks or weekend activities maybe once or twice a month rather than maintaining his previous pattern of complete social withdrawal. These social interactions were still exhausting and were still not something he looked forward to, but they felt slightly less threatening and more manageable, and he recognized intellectually that maintaining some social connections beyond his professional obligations was probably necessary for long-term well-being even if it didn't feel immediately rewarding. He made some modest changes to his apartment, purchased few plants that required minimal maintenance but that added some life to the space, replaced the generic prints on his walls with some architectural photographs that actually reflected his aesthetic interests, began keeping his kitchen better stocked so he could prepare actual meals rather than just eating takeout or simple snacks. These changes didn't transform the apartment into space that felt like home exactly, but they did make it feel slightly more intentional and less like temporary accommodation he'd been occupying by default. The cumulative effect of these various small changes was that Julian's life was becoming slightly richer and more engaged even as his outward persona was becoming quieter and more withdrawn. The apparent contradiction made sense from internal perspective. The morning reflection sessions were creating increased self-awareness and clarity about what mattered to him and what changes were necessary, which was manifesting in more deliberate and authentic choices about how to live. But that same self-awareness was also making him less interested in superficial social performance and more comfortable with being genuinely quiet rather than performing extroversion he didn't feel. One evening in early December, approximately 5 weeks after beginning his practice of speaking to his reflection, Julian returned home from a particularly long and frustrating day at work. Project that had been proceeding smoothly had encountered unexpected complications that had required extensive redesign. Client had been difficult and demanding in ways that had tested his patience. Several meetings had run long and had consumed time he'd planned to use for focused design work. He was exhausted and discouraged, was questioning whether his work was actually meaningful or was just producing buildings that served primarily commercial purposes without contributing anything of genuine value. He stood in his bathroom preparing for evening hygiene routine, looked at his reflection with the same deliberate attention he'd been bringing to his morning sessions. But instead of asking practical questions or making confessions about specific actions or decisions, he found himself asking something more fundamental. Are you proud of me? The question hung in the air of the small bathroom, created different quality of silence than his previous reflection sessions had generated. This wasn't a question that prompted immediate internal response or that could be answered with simple honesty about particular behaviors or choices. This was a question about overall assessment of his life and his choices and his character, was asking for judgment about whether the person he'd become and the life he'd constructed were worthy of pride or whether they fell short of what he should have achieved or become. He waited for response, not from the reflection obviously, but from his internal awareness, from whatever part of himself had been responding to the questions and observations he'd been addressing to the mirror over the past weeks. But no clear response emerged. Just continued silence, just his own tired eyes staring back at him from the mirror, just awareness that the question didn't have simple answer and that the absence of answer was itself significant. The silence and the absence of easy answer forced different kind of recognition, that his reflection had never actually been separate entity offering judgment or validation, that what had been happening during these morning sessions was that he'd been creating structured space for honest self-examination rather than receiving external assessment. The value of the practice wasn't that the reflection was providing answers or approval, but that the act of articulating questions and concerns and observations aloud was helping him access greater clarity about his own thoughts and values and about the gaps between how he was living and how he wanted to live. The question, "Are you proud of me?" couldn't be answered by the reflection because pride or disappointment weren't judgments that could come from external source. They had to come from his own assessment of whether he was living according to values and priorities he actually held rather than according to values he'd inherited or assumed without examination. And making that assessment required ongoing honest engagement with difficult questions about what he valued and what kind of person he wanted to become and whether his current choices were aligned with those values and aspirations. The recognition was both disappointing and liberating. Disappointing because it meant he couldn't rely on the reflection sessions to provide external validation or to resolve his uncertainties about whether he was living well. But liberating because it meant the practice he'd developed was something he could continue indefinitely without needing external confirmation that he was doing it correctly, was tool for ongoing self-examination rather than being dependent on some imagined external authority providing judgment about his choices and his character. Over the subsequent months, Julian's practice of speaking to his reflection continued and became thoroughly integrated into his daily routine, but his understanding of what the practice was accomplishing evolved from initial sense that he was having conversations with external entity to clearer recognition that he was using the reflection as focusing device for structured self-examination. The shift in understanding didn't diminish the practice's value. If anything, Understanding that the value came from his own honest engagement rather than from imagined external judgment made the practice feel more sustainable and less dependent on maintaining any particular beliefs about what the reflection represented. The morning sessions remained approximately 5 to 10 minutes most days, though occasionally they'd extend to 15 or 20 minutes when he was working through particularly complex or emotionally difficult topics. The format became more structured over time. He developed habit of beginning each session with brief review of previous day, acknowledging what had gone well and what had gone poorly, identifying what he wanted to focus on for the current day. Then he'd address whatever specific questions or concerns were most present: work decisions, relationship challenges, internal conflicts about how to spend his time or what priorities to maintain. The practice created cumulative effects that were significant even though they were difficult to measure or to attribute directly to the reflection sessions versus to other factors that were also operating in his life. His architectural work continued developing in directions that felt more meaningful and aligned with his actual values. He was designing buildings that prioritized human experience and social value rather than just formal innovation or commercial efficiency, was increasingly willing to advocate for design approaches that served broader social purposes even when those approaches were more challenging or less immediately profitable than conventional alternatives. His personal life remained fairly solitary but became somewhat less isolated. He maintained more consistent contact with his sister, developed slightly closer relationships with the few colleagues he considered friends, occasionally made efforts to engage in social activities or to pursue interests outside of work even when those efforts felt uncomfortable or didn't immediately generate satisfaction. The changes were modest and his life remained quite different from what most people would consider socially rich or emotionally connected, but they represented movement toward greater engagement and toward resisting the complete withdrawal that had characterized his existence before beginning the reflection practice. His relationship to his apartment and to his daily routines also shifted. The space still wasn't home in the sense of feeling deeply personal or perfectly suited to his needs, but it had become more intentional and less provisional, reflected more conscious choices about how he wanted to live rather than just being default accommodation he'd settled for. His routines remained structured and consistent but had become more flexible and more responsive to actual needs rather than being rigidly maintained regardless of circumstances. Perhaps most significantly, his internal experience had changed in ways that were difficult to articulate but that he nonetheless recognized as meaningful. He was more aware of his thoughts and feelings as they were occurring rather than just reacting to them automatically or suppressing them when they were uncomfortable. He was more able to identify when he was avoiding something or deceiving himself about his motivations. He was more comfortable with uncertainty and with not having clear answers to difficult questions about how to live or what to prioritize. The increased self-awareness didn't make his life easier exactly. In some ways it made things harder because he could no longer rely on comfortable avoidances and rationalizations that had previously allowed him to function without confronting difficult truths about himself and his choices. But it did make his life feel more authentic and more aligned with his actual values rather than with inherited expectations or default patterns, made him feel like he was making genuine choices about how to live rather than just drifting through existence according to whatever paths required least resistance. 2 years after first speaking to his reflection on that November morning, Julian's life looked fairly similar in its external details to how it had looked before. He still worked at the same architecture firm in the same senior architect role, still lived in the same apartment in the same building, still maintained fairly solitary lifestyle without extensive social connections or romantic relationship. Someone observing from outside might conclude that his life hadn't changed significantly, that whatever internal work he'd been doing through his reflection practice hadn't translated into meaningful external transformation. But Julian's internal experience of his life had changed substantially in ways that weren't visible to external observation. He was living more deliberately and more consciously, was making active choices about how to spend his time and energy rather than just following default patterns established years earlier, was more honest with himself about what he valued and what he wanted even when that honesty revealed gaps between his current life and his ideals that created discomfort or demanded difficult changes. The morning reflection practice continued, had become so thoroughly integrated into his routine that it felt as essential and automatic as showering or brushing teeth, was no longer strange or self-conscious but just normal part of how he started each day. He still spoke to his reflection each morning, still used that practice as container for honest self-examination, still found value in the clarity and accountability that articulating thoughts aloud created, even though he no longer had any illusions that the reflection was responding or that he was receiving external guidance rather than generating his own insights. The practice had also expanded beyond just the morning bathroom sessions. He'd begun speaking to himself, not to his reflection specifically but just aloud to empty apartment, during evening hours when he was working through difficult design problems or making decisions about personal matters. The act of verbalizing thoughts continued to be valuable for accessing clarity and honesty that silent thinking didn't achieve as effectively, continued to create slight distance between thinking self and observing self that made it easier to identify when he was avoiding or deceiving himself. He'd never told anyone about the reflection practice or about his habit of speaking his thoughts aloud. It remained completely private, was something he engaged in only when alone and that he carefully concealed from his colleagues and his sister and anyone else who might observe and might judge it as eccentric or concerning. The privacy felt important. The practice worked partly because it was protected space where he could be completely honest without any concern about external judgment or about how his thoughts might be perceived by others. His architectural work had continued developing in the directions that had begun emerging shortly after he started the reflection practice. He'd been promoted to principal architect, had been given more autonomy over project selection and design direction, had developed reputation within the firm for producing innovative work that combined formal sophistication with genuine attention to human experience and social value. The professional recognition was gratifying and felt earned, felt like result of sustained commitment to developing his craft and his thinking rather than just being fortunate circumstance or political maneuvering. His personal life remained fairly solitary but had achieved equilibrium that felt sustainable rather than problematic. He'd accepted that he was probably never going to be a particularly social person with extensive friendship networks and active romantic life, that his temperament and his preferences were oriented towards solitude and toward focused engagement with work rather than towards social connection. But he'd also developed more realistic understanding of what minimal social engagement was necessary for long-term well-being, had established patterns of maintaining contact with his sister and with the few people he considered friends that prevented complete isolation without requiring the extensive social performance that felt exhausting and inauthentic. Looking back on the 2 years since beginning the reflection practice, Julian recognized that the changes in his life had been substantial even though they weren't dramatic or externally visible. He hadn't quit his job to pursue some completely different career path, hadn't moved to a different city or radically restructured his daily existence, hadn't formed transformative relationships or achieved major life milestones that would be obvious markers of change. But he had shifted from living somewhat automatically and reactively to living more deliberately and authentically, had developed practices and awareness that allowed him to navigate his life with greater consciousness and agency, had become more aligned with his actual values rather than just following inherited scripts about how he was supposed to live. The transformation had occurred through accumulated small changes and through sustained practice of self-examination rather than through any single dramatic revelation or external intervention. The reflection practice had been catalyst and container for that transformation, had provided structure that supported honest engagement with difficult questions about how to live even when that engagement was uncomfortable and even when the answers weren't immediately clear or satisfying. Self-reflection doesn't always need an audience. The most transformative conversations often happen in silence, with nothing but your own eyes to witness the truth you're finally willing to acknowledge. Julian's practice of speaking to his bathroom mirror wasn't magic ritual that provided supernatural guidance or that connected him to external wisdom, was just structured way of creating space for honest self-examination that normal internal monologue often avoids through distraction and rationalization. The specific practice that worked for Julian, speaking to his reflection each morning, might not work for you or might feel too strange to pursue. But the underlying principle is available through many different forms: journaling, meditation, long walks where you talk through your thoughts aloud, therapy or coaching sessions with trained professionals, conversations with trusted friends who can hold space for honest examination without judgment. The form matters less than the commitment to creating protected time and space for engaging honestly with difficult questions about how you're living and whether that's aligned with what you actually value. The practice requires accepting that clarity and transformation typically emerge gradually through sustained engagement rather than arriving as sudden dramatic insights. Requires accepting that honest self-examination will reveal uncomfortable truths about your motivations, about your avoidances, about gaps between your ideals and your actual choices, that you'll need to sit with and work through rather than immediately resolving. Requires accepting that the value comes from the practice itself rather than from any particular outcomes, that you're engaging in ongoing process rather than completing finite task. But the practice also offers rewards that justify the discomfort and the sustained effort. Offers possibility of living more deliberately and more authentically rather than just following default patterns established by circumstance or inheritance. Offers greater alignment between your daily choices and your actual values rather than just operating according to what you think you should value or what others expect. Offers sense of agency and authorship over your own life rather than feeling like passive recipient of whatever happens to occur. So create your own practice of structured self-reflection, whatever form that takes. Find protected time and space where you can engage honestly with difficult questions without immediate pressure to resolve them or to perform particular answers for others. Be willing to articulate uncomfortable truths about yourself and your choices rather than maintaining comfortable self-deceptions. Trust that clarity and transformation emerge through sustained engagement rather than through dramatic single insights. Sometimes, the most transformative conversations happen in silence, with nothing but your own eyes to witness the truth. Be StoryWise.